Welcome back to Economics. I'm Dr. Kling. We've been talking about outsourcing, and so far we've been talking about it as sort of a case-by-case basis. So you outsource your typing to a secretary, or you outsource your typing to a computer, or you outsource your laundry to a washing machine, sort of a case-by-case basis. Now I want to talk about outsourcing and how it looks from the standpoint of the economy as a whole. And from the economy as a whole, I'm going to argue that the economy as a whole is outsourced beyond all recognition. And that's a play on an expression that you'll see called FOBAR, which I think originated in the military but is pretty popular among the tech community. And I will say that we could say it translates as fouled up, put that in quotes, beyond all recognition or recovery or something like that. I think that's what that stands for. If not, I'm making up a good story. So what I want to argue is that the economy is sort of outsourced beyond all recognition. That is, and let me maybe explain what I mean. What would I mean by beyond all recognition? Let's imagine ourselves back in early 1942 in the United States, or maybe right after Pearl Harbor in 1941. And so we've got a problem to fight World War II. And you ask the service chiefs, well, what are we going to need to win World War II? And they tell you we're going to need 25,000 fighter planes and 30,000 bombers. I'm making stuff up, obviously. I don't know what they said. How many tanks, trucks, munitions, battleships. I mean, there's all this stuff. And your job, let's say, is to figure out, well, are their requests feasible, or are we going to have to ask them to cut back on some of these things because we just can't build all this stuff? And so you want to figure out, well, what are the requirements in terms of things like fundamental things like steel or oil for energy, rubber. Other important commodities. Actually, labor will be very important. So just what is actually feasible here? How would you solve that problem? And let me give you somebody. This is Vasily Leontiev, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, and he came up with an idea for solving this sort of problem. It's called an input-output table. And so you sort of lay the inputs down the left column and the outputs on the vertical row, and with enough manipulation you can finally figure out, well, exactly how much steel would you need for all these things, because the steel is needed not just for the final products but for intermediate products. You don't just need it to make the tank, you need it to make the machine tools that you're going to use to make the tank. So the math gets pretty complex. So he's perhaps entitled to his Nobel Prize. But in fact, this input-output approach doesn't work. So in reality, go away. In reality, the input-output approach does not work. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is it sort of oversimplifies the technology. It tends to overlook substitution. It just says we need these inputs to produce these outputs, but it ignores the fact that, well, maybe if relative prices were a little different, or if people understood the scarcity a little better, they would make substitutions that would make it easier to produce things. But the main and maybe this is related to the issue of substitution, but the main reason that the input-output approach doesn't work is because the economy has gotten so complex. There's outsourcing beyond all recognition. You could not even create an input-output table for today's economy. You just wouldn't know. It's just there are too many different goods and services, and there are too many ways that processes that are outsourced in very complicated ways. And one way to think of outsourcing is sort of like you have a tree, and I'm going to be very sketchy with a tree. Maybe I should have just shown a picture of a saguaro cactus or something, because I can't draw trees. You can see how bad my handwriting is. Imagine me trying to draw a tree. But a tree starts to grow branches, and then the branches start to grow branches, and then the branches start to grow branches, and you can see how that would just extend and extend until you wouldn't be able to see from the original tree, you wouldn't be able to see all of the sub-branches in the tree. And that's what I mean, another way of trying to express this sort of beyond all recognition. You cannot tally all the possible ways of producing things in the country, which is what you need to do the input-output table. Now, back when you had this military problem, we weren't trying to figure out how to produce all the possible things in the whole economy. We were only trying to produce a few things, bombers, fighters, battleships, and so on. So, in principle, if they'd had an input-output table at that point, they might have been able to go pretty far with it. But when you're talking about an economy where you're producing, services in so many different ways, it's just no longer possible to take a bird's eye view, sit on top of the economy, and find one of these input-output tables, and that no one person can see all of what's going on in the economy in order to produce this kind of input-output table. And if they ever did tally something like this up, by the time they'd finished, it would be out of date because somebody would have invented new types of cell phones, new biotechnologies, and all the things that people are in the process of inventing. So you cannot describe the economy from sitting in one place. There are bound to be, most of the things going on in the economy are going to be unknown to people involved. That will include the heads of corporations, and so that's why corporations tend to have to outsource themselves. So a corporation faces a choice: do we outsource a function or do we integrate it? Classic example from the personal computer era. Do we integrate hardware and software? That was the choice that Steve Jobs made with Apple. Apple had its own software, its own hardware in the original Macintosh computer and the computers that preceded it. The IBM PC was the opposite. They outsourced their operating system to Microsoft. So IBM built the first personal computer of its type, but they outsourced the operating system to Microsoft. And that's a famous strategic decision because IBM was thinking at the time, well, a computer is a piece of hardware, and the operating system is just this little thing that goes with it. So if we sell all the hardware, we'll make all the money. And when it all shook out, the hardware became kind of a commodity, the operating system became crucial, and Microsoft made all the money. So in hindsight, you can say, well, what a dumb decision to outsource to Microsoft. But those are decisions that corporations have to make, and in general, the more integrated they try to be, ultimately the more clumsy and awkward they become, because it just gets harder for them to see all of what's going on. And I'll just give a couple examples of describe just how complex the outsourcing is. You can look at these on your own. This is a famous thing called iPencil by Leonard Reed, which just shows just how complex the process is in creating a pencil. There are a lot of things that pencil manufacturers have to outsource in order to produce pencils. And then this is, I've talked about this before, the toaster story about somebody who tried to build his own toaster. Again, because the actual toaster manufacturer is outsourcing in such a deep and complex way, it's really hard for any individual to then come back and integrate that toaster building process. So in the real world, the toaster process is a complex array of outsourcing that, it's outsourced beyond all recognition, and this poor guy trying to integrate it gives you a clue as to how beyond all recognition it was. And that's it. Thanks.